hope the building isn't struck by lightning because I'm here all hooked up electronically. That might not be well. I always appreciate an opportunity to stand while everyone else sits so that I can look at people eye to eye. And so I hope everyone can see me. If not, please just raise your hand and I'll try to stand on my tiptoes. Well, today is not simply the first full day of this conference. It's also October the 1st, the first full day of our nation's fiscal year. Our country begins today with a fresh budget, as people no doubt know. That's what a fiscal year is about. A clean slate, a new plan that seeks to match our fiscal blueprint with our social and economic needs. At least that's how it's supposed to happen, right? So we know from many years past, including the current one, that we do not, here on October 1st, have a fiscal blueprint for fiscal year 2011. But anyway, on paper, that's what's supposed to happen. Nevertheless, today is a good day, as any day, but certainly maybe better than most, to commit or recommit ourselves to view our government and economy with fresh eyes and an inquisitive mind. When it comes to economic matters, this includes not simply looking differently at our federal budget policies or looking differently at our tax policies, but also looking differently at our federal monetary policies. For probably everyone in this room, this makes absolutely perfect sense. Budget, tax, and monetary policies go hand in hand. Understanding our nation's policies and economy are directly linked. Seeing the connections between wars and the power, or lack thereof, to directly create or control money by we the people are a given. But that's not true, as we well know, for the majority of people in this country. Monetary issues are foreign, alien, cosmic, on the same level of familiarity as understanding the nebulas of the universe, so it seems. What exactly is money? How is it created? What purposes does it serve? Who controls the monetary spigot? And how does it profoundly impact virtually every other element of our economy, nation, and, in fact, world? If aware of monetary issues at all, these are questions that people ask, are they not? That's how it was for me. I'm relatively new to this field. I never learned about monetary issues in school, never heard or read about it in the mainstream, quote-unquote, news, never debated whether or how to organize around it. In the 25 years that I've been involved in social education, advocacy, and organizing for a change. But then I discovered it. I read, and I read some more, including The Lost Science of Money, twice. I organized others to study and discuss. I helped organize Steve Zarlenga to come to my part of the world in Northeast Ohio to conduct a workshop. And we organized then delegations to meet with our two aides to our two U.S. senators and aides to our 3 area U.S. representatives. We didn't need to meet with Dennis Kucinich since he's pretty much already on board. And we encouraged them to read, to study, to reflect, and of course to co-sponsor the American Monetary Act. We've shown and continue to show the film Money as Debt. But it's only the beginning. We're all only at the start of what needs to happen to bring fundamental change, to democratize our society, in fact, to democratize our money. That's our quest, is it not? Part of what needs to be, I believe, our life's work. It all begins at the beginning with study and research, rigorous study. The Lost Science of Money is certainly, maybe in this field anyway, the single best example on monetary issues of rigorous study and research. Rigor being the operative word. It means taking the time to widely, deeply, exactly, and precisely examine a topic. It's what I learned from those who launched the organization I'm connected with today called the Program on Corporations, Law, and Democracy, POCLAD, which nearly 20 years ago began as a group of, we call ourselves, frustrated activists who were tired of constantly reacting and responding to one corporate assault at a time, and decided to step back and examine the state of social change organizing. POCLAD investigates and instigates democratic conversations and actions that contest the authority of business corporations to rule, to govern. Their analysis evolves through historical and legal research, writing, public speaking, and working with organizations to develop new strategies that assert people's rights over propertied interests. POCLAD began focused on historical and legal research and study, rigorous research and study on the nature of the corporate form. It was the first organized group to deeply examine the issue of corporate rights. And what they discovered was that the American Revolution was waged not simply against the King of England and his army, but against the King's crown corporations, like the Massachusetts Bay Company, the Carolina Company, the Virginia Company, the Baltimore Company, and others, who had the power given by the King of England to rule, to govern. Corporate charters were democratic institutions used following the Revolution by the colonists to define and not regulate corporate actions. Legislatures and courts controlled by both Democrats and Republicans, as POCLAD learned through their rigorous research and study, dissolved corporations that acted in ways not defined in their charters or licenses. The ability of business corporations today to do what they want, where they want, whenever they want, was never intended, we found out, by our nation's founders. Corporate behavior is not a given. It's not like gravity or some other law of physics. It can be changed. POCLAD injected the concept of corporate personhood into our culture. They cautioned against the distractions of spending too much time reacting to this or that boycott, pleading with corporate executives to sign voluntary codes of conduct, or working legislatively to slightly reduce the amount of, say, poisons permitted in our air or water. Changing constitutional and legal governing rules was more important than changing political faces, political parties, or slight laws regulating corporate harms. The right to decide and the right to rule by human persons were the crux. The Bill of Rights, POCLAD believed, and still believes, was and is intended for people, not corporations, which are no more than a bunch of legal documents. As it dug deeper and reflected on what it learned, POCLAD realized the core issue was not corporate power, but our lack of power, our relative disempowerment. It was about overcoming the what we call colonization of our minds. That is, that our history and culture has limited what we consider possible, practical, and achievable. Gaining and proclaiming real self-governance should be our ultimate quest. Finally, POCLAD believed that rigorous study and research on this issue was the single most important action that needed to be taken. We looked at study and research not just simply as study and research, but as an action, given the lack of understanding of these issues, including among social change activists. Helping activists, in fact, reframe strategies and campaigns to address core causes could only happen until corporate constitutional rights and how they came to be was dissolved. POCLAD produced a definitive work called Define Corporations, Defining Democracy. It's a hardback book, yellow in fact, very much like The Lost Science of Money, in the sense of it was sort of the definitive initial definition, laying out both intellectually as well as providing some ideas of what could be done. So it's an equivalent of sorts to The Lost Science of Money. POCLAD has since, like the American Monetary Institute, produced other resources. It's produced a newsletter called By What Authority, and it's held, like what Stephen has done, and gone around the country, led workshops on the issue. In the case of POCLAD, called Rethinking the Corporation, Rethinking Democracy. Now, these messages and lessons from my involvement with POCLAD over the last dozen years is the lens I look through when reflecting on the importance of rigorous research and study today on monetary issues as the essential first step of real social change. Why begin with rigorous study and research? I believe for 6 reasons. First, to know history. We must know what's worked and what hasn't. Who are our past heroes and sheroes? And what lessons can be applied today? We must know what Aristotle said about money existing not by nature, but by law. We must know that we, the people, actually issued our own money through the Continentals and the Greenbacks, and that they were, during their times, effective. We must know how the money-making powers became privatized, or I prefer the term corporatized, more descriptive, in our nation and across the world. And we must know that how money backed by precious metals in the past have caused recessions and depressions and placed monetary authority in the hands of bankers and those outside our nation. That's the first reason why we must begin with rigorous research and study. Second, to understand how monetary issues are connected to other issues. The privatization or corporatization of money is not an abstract issue. It's connected to our national debt and deficit through the interest incurred from having to borrow money that could be publicly created. It's associated with taxes, as borrowed money must be paid back with interest. It's linked to wars and occupations, as financial interests have encouraged nations to borrow money to wage wars, which create economic dependency. It's related to the environmental crisis, as material resources absolutely must be exploited to generate the income to pay for the exponential debt that corporatized debt money creates. And it's connected to jobs, education, healthcare, and infrastructure, as government-issued democratic money could be issued debt and inflation-free if spent on meeting real social and economic needs. This last point is especially timely, since, as was mentioned yesterday by Dick Distelhorst, tomorrow, hundreds of thousands of people, it's estimated nearly 500,000 people, will be rallying in Washington, D.C., under the banner of One Nation Coming Together, calling for jobs and education. We, in fact, in my part of the world, in northern Ohio, have worked to organize a number of buses to go there. Nowhere, however, in the list of One Nation Coming Together demands, unfortunately, is the call for the issuance of debt and inflation-free government-issued democratic money. So we have our work cut out for us. The third reason why beginning with rigorous research and study is important: to learn what's happening elsewhere. The corporatization of money has caused and is causing economic havoc in nations, which launched earlier this year a regional electronic currency, Sucre. Existing positive developments are occurring in the United States as well, as we heard yesterday from people Dee and Ben, who I guess are of a similar stature, at least height-wise, as me, about the Green Party's monetary reform plank. So we need to know what's happening elsewhere so that we can learn from them, combine forces, develop networks and alliances, learn what works, what doesn't, what can be applied to wherever we are. Fourth, the reason why it's so important, I believe, for rigorous research and study is to avoid becoming distracted by quote-unquote reforms which fail to address the core problem. Why Lake Erie, which is a few miles from where I live, is considered to be the most dangerous of all the Great Lakes, if you're boating or fishing or anything, is because of its shallowness. Lack of depth on any issue makes one highly susceptible to the latest diversionary reforms, winds that can easily lead us off course. The entire debate around the congressional banking reform siphoned off tremendous energy, for example, for what in the end turned out to be pathetic legislation that will further consolidate financial institutions and permit the continuation of derivatives and other forms of exotic casino financial speculation. Yet there was tremendous amounts of energy that were directed by very well-meaning activists thinking that that was going to be sort of the fundamental change that was required. Critically important campaigns connected to the effects of the corporatization of money, such as working to extend unemployment insurance, placing a moratorium on home foreclosures, and addressing the climate crisis, while incredibly important in working on one level, are still nevertheless campaigns that focus on saving those who are downstream drowning, rather than preventing people from being thrown into the water upstream. Those who promote other forms of financial reform, such as auditing the Federal Reserve, state-owned banks, and even local financial alternatives, are also diversionary. Then, of course, maybe the ultimate diversionary approach and tactic that serves as a sinkhole of energy is elections, or our elections, where it is often believed that changing faces is often presented as the surest approach, the best approach to changing fundamental structures and rules. We can get into this, I'm sure. We'll have some time for cussing and discussing about this and other matters. Fifth, the reason to engage in rigorous study and research is to know best how to respond to arguments against fundamental monetary reform. Any widespread call to democratize money will result, surely, in a plutocratic pushback of epic proportions. Arguments against fiat money have gone on, of course, for centuries, as have been well chronicled in the lost science of money. Only those who are well grounded in research and study will be inoculated to withstand the intellectual germs from those who charge government is incompetent, corrupt, inefficient, can't be trusted, all of the above. That there is no historical successes of democratic money. That the Federal Reserve is a government institution. That banks really know what they're doing and should be in charge. That the only honest money is money backed by gold or silver. And that we should just simply let the invisible hand in the market take care of the problem and do their economic thing. Lastly, the sixth reason why it's important to engage in rigorous study and research is to develop a reservoir of knowledge needed to intellectually create campaigns, strategies, and tactics. While research and study, as I mentioned earlier, are a beginning and are, as POCLAD has defined, and I think many people here would agree, should be seen as an action in itself, given where we are in the culture at large, where most people don't know much about this issue. Nevertheless, they are the beginning and not the ends. Our eye on the prize, ultimately, is it not, is the democratization of money, and by extension, creating a real democracy in our society. That can only happen after we have a firm foundation of the theories, experiences, issues, and practitioners. When well-grounded, we can then be in a better position to explore how one-at-a-time issues, like the current jobs crisis, or like climate change, or like home foreclosure epidemics that currently exist in our society, can be used as stepping stones to build our cause for fundamental change. We can also better consider how efforts to audit the Federal Reserve and even local currencies might, if created properly, be complementary rather than competitive strategies in the quest to pass the American Monetary Act. Ultimately, our goal, is it not, is to popularize this issue, if it is ever going to become viral. This can't happen unless we develop culturally appropriate educational tools and connect what seems to be an abstract issue to everyday problems. These are then the main reasons why study and action of monetary issues is critical. In conclusion, when and where social change movements throughout history have been successful, at least through my casual reading, have been when and where at least two characteristics have been present. The first is where people engage in what can be called deliberate action reflection process, where people in community reflect on their conditions, where they've come from, who they are, who they want to be, what they want to do. This reflection derives and decides their actions, which in turn provides experiences to circle back, to reflect on what worked and what needs to be tried next. This action reflection process never stops. The Christian-based communities of Central and South America are maybe the most famous and maybe dramatic and recently successful examples to what has led to a number of revolutionary social and political liberation movements that we have seen blossom over the past decade in South America and to a certain extent Central America. I would assert that part of that has come from this deliberative action reflection process that of course includes rigorous research and study. The second characteristic of successful social movements throughout history, I believe, is the dual simultaneous strategies of social change and social service organized by the same people and group at the same time. Gandhians understand this concept well. It means to work on changing macro structures, laws, rules, and institutions at the same time as working on creating local or parallel structures that show what can be done if people were in charge. Argentinians call this horizontalism. These local or parallel structures serve important meeting social needs, recruitment, publicity, and experimentation purposes. Calling for fundamental structural change gains credibility and constituents if we're working to address short-term needs through grassroots and democratic monetary projects and groups. I raise these two characteristics because I feel, for what it's worth, the drive for profound monetary change, for the democratization of money, has plenty of constructive room for macro action strategies and for micro complementary monetary projects that when added together will create a social movement for real change. Henry David Thoreau wrote, "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, to every one striking at the root." May our collective work on monetary issues during this brand new fiscal year and beyond, of rigorous study and research, of actions, of macro and micro, be focused not on branches, but on roots. Thanks. We have people who are willing to lob things. I will try to.
Helen has a microphone.
Thank you very much for your well-articulated thoughts and lessons. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about how your organization works, if you are beyond Northeast Ohio, how you actually do the rigorous study among all of your members, wherever they are.
Well, I guess I need to ask by what organization I wear, as I'm sure many of us do, many hats. But if in particular the sort of the POCLAD hat,
Yes,
which has evolved into what I've not really mentioned much at all, what has sprung from that group of frustrated activists has led to this new effort called Move to Amend that seeks to literally amend the United States Constitution to abolish corporate personhood, corporate constitutional rights. And actually includes what was mentioned yesterday, I think it was Dick saying, among the most important changes above passing the American Monetary Act should be to eliminate the big money in elections. That derives from another constitutional decision and case called Buckley versus Vallejo, passed in 1976, that equates money with free speech. To me, money's property, it's not free speech, but they did. So anyway, the evolution of POCLAD to that group today called Move to Amend, and you can check out their website, movetoamend.org. There are now over 85,000 people who have signed a petition calling for this. And basically what happened is for years and years, POCLAD was planting these seeds, going around, doing this rigorous research, delving into the lost history of how corporations at one time were subordinate to we the people. They were not on equal par. They didn't have greater rights. They had fewer. In fact, they had no rights. And that was not known. That wasn't well versed in the common culture. It wasn't taught in schools. It wasn't even aware of in sort of activist circles. And how that came to be was people, again, just out of sheer frustration, feeling that we just can't perpetually react and respond and boycott this fruit or that vegetable. I mean, there's a lot of fruits and vegetables out there that we could be boycotting one at a time forever, or lots of articles of clothing, or lots of types of ham and the like. We got to figure out something different. Let's look upstream. And so the upstream was looking into this hidden history and spending an inordinate amount of time looking at it. Like anybody that does legal research, once you get into a case and you see all those footnotes, I mean, look at Lost Science of Money, all those hundreds of footnotes, you start getting into this gigantic maze that literally is never ending. And one research article that's extraordinary leads you to 5 others and 5 more others. So you start putting together this puzzle, this mosaic, developing this picture of how at one time it was very different. And when you begin to develop that kind of understanding, you obviously want to go out and test that to see if it resonates with people. And that's where these workshops were so important. Rethinking the corporation, rethinking democracy, and served as a vital springboard for bringing in other people, for engaging other people, for recruiting other people who in turn would go to their respective communities. So maybe a lesson learned there and to apply here is we need to figure out how best to take this extraordinary amount of material and insightful information and figure out some way to each one teach one by pressing the flesh. And you know, high tech is very important. Things like developing DVDs and those sorts of materials. But as you need high tech, you also need high touch. And nothing beats coming together in groups and exchanging and interchanging, debating, cussing, discussing. Nothing beats that. Particularly if the goal is to change and break out of this colonization of the mind, which I think applies to monetary issues as much as it does that, oh, we're weak, we can't stand up against corporations, they're inevitable, they're irreplaceable and all of that. No, the only way to do that is you've got to engage, it's got to be direct, it's got to be reinforced, just like you take vitamins every day to inoculate yourself from the germs outside. You've got to be figure out a way to be accessible to this information very regularly. So that may be one of a variety of strategies that I would respectfully introduce to all of you and to the movement at large.
I have the microphone. Hello. I just have a question. I loved your talk. Made me think a lot and want to know more. When you approach, there's so many progressive groups. I remember reading this book, was basically written for activists to say, if everyone in their consciousness knew how many millions of people around the world were working for all different types of progressive causes, we wouldn't feel so alone. So my question to you is, when you approach a progressive group, what are your arguments to say to them, because here all their energy is devoted to their group, that the monetary issue is the major one? What are your arguments that they, I mean, that's to me like a key when I try to talk to people.
Is that not the challenge that we're all grappling with and trying to figure out the best approach? Either the 30-second elevator speech approach or the 2-minute, if you have somebody sort of trapped in a room and you got there and you're in between where they are and the door, you may have 2 minutes to work on them, soften them up. Or your one sheet. And we tried, for example, in Northeast Ohio, we tried to boil down the law science of money into one sheet, front and back. And have been, trying to hand that out and see if that connects. It's going to be like this action reflection, this scientific approach of trial and error to see what works. I think one of the approaches is to go the other way and say, how much longer can we sort of one at a time deal with some of these problems without examining sort of the root issues? We can firefight, and firefighting is essential. And we're not saying that you should give up firefighting, that you should give up working on those immediate issues. But shouldn't you spend, and is it not worthy of spending even 10% of your time, or 10% of your argument, or 10% of your print space, as you're talking about, say, single-payer universal health care? Okay, just take that as an example, to show how that's connected to the fact that corporations are in the position to decide, to make the fundamental issue of how much health care we will have and who, it's not we and our doctors that's making the decisions, it's the healthcare corporations doing it. So that's the way to approach, I think, these groups that are siloed. And I think that's sort of the challenge, is so many of us have this silo mentality of where we have got, we know cold the issues around joblessness or healthcare or the wars and occupations, or you fill in the blank. You fill in the blank. We know that stuff down. But making the connections and seeing these larger issues, I think the entry point is by suggesting sort of a little slice. So as we try to do with POCLAD, to say, take 10% of that, and would you be willing to sort of make the link, same with monetary issues? I know. I'm just saying, though, from where I have had... What I'm saying is, from my experience in taking a single issue and connecting it to corporate constitutional rights, that's what I've done. That's where I have more experience in. But I think the principle is of doing the exact same thing when it comes to monetary issues, of saying, will you not devote 10% of your time, your energy, your space to making that connection to monetary issues?
The whole thing, everything you said, had a very big effect on me. Now, how do we do it? What I'd like to do is recommend something that the Federal Reserve does. In other words, to educate people, you got putting out big, thick books, one after the other. We've all put out books and things of that nature. Why don't we take a lesson from the Federal Reserve? How many of you have ever ordered documents from the Federal Reserve? If not, get online. They got 16 books that they'll give you 35 copies each for free. And it tells you exactly how great they are, why they do the things they do. And you understand every page they're on without any problem whatsoever. Do you know why? They're comic books. And I'm quoting, I got pictures right here. For example, if we understood the purpose of money, I'm looking at one right now. They got an article on why we have money, to avoid the bartering system. And it says, right, you can't avoid, you have to have a bartering system because if we didn't have money, we'd have to exchange. If you wanted to buy some meat, or if we want to come here, we'd have to bring something to bartering. They got a beautiful book on why you have to have money.
And so what's your question?
No, I'm going to ask you, why don't we, when we put out articles trying to educate the people, which is what you're saying we have to do, we have to educate them. I'm just making a recommendation. We got to stop thinking about putting out another book, until we get to the point when we put something out, it's so simple that any 12-year-old can understand it. And our problem is we're not getting our message out because nobody's going to read the books. When they read them, they're not sure they understood what's in them. Let's put out comic books.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good point. I mean, certainly figuring out a way to, as people in Central and South America have done, in developing efforts to popularize material. What's that? In fact, the whole field of popular education is a notion of taking an issue and starting with where people are, using their base of experience as the beginning point, and then from there connecting to larger issues that to them seem more abstract. It's a challenge because we come from a culture in which education is just the opposite. It's top down. It starts from the premise that we're empty vessels and that we as students know zero, and teachers, their job is to fill up those empty vessels. It's not to begin with a nurturing or a reinforcement of what people know. So part of our challenge, you're absolutely right, sir, is to figure out how to take this stuff, that which has already been produced. I mean, to a certain extent, that whole book, you look at the first 10 pages, this is a really fine summation. If we could just get this document, the first 10 pages of it, in the hands of folks and working with them to discuss, to go, it's got to be more than just sending them a DVD or giving them a book or making it accessible online. That's important. It's not either or. In a sense, it's both. There's room for both. And you're exactly right. The Federal Reserve, just in Cleveland, where one of the Federal Reserve banks are located, the other day they had a big article in the paper about how proud they were that they sponsored this whole-day seminar for kids to help them understand economic literacy. So how can we compete against that? Well, we don't have unlimited monies, but we do have the ability to think creatively and develop some way to boil this material down. But it's got to be, in part, a big part, I feel, is figuring out ways to bring people together and each one teach one.
I appreciate very much what you've been saying. I'd just like to suggest an alternative way of summing up what I see to be your key message. One of the most effective social activists in Canada is Tony Clark, and I heard him say one time that on most social issues, we're constantly in retreat, and we're on the defensive. We need to find issues that enable us to go on the offensive. And this issue of the change in the monetary system is the most potent offensive issue that I have ever seen. And it seems to me it's necessary for us to make use of the commitments of social justice organizations that have been working on a wide variety of the issues that you mentioned, poverty and pollution and on and on, and get a coalition of these groups to push for monetary policy change is one of the things that they work for, and along with labor unions and so on. And I've been trying to get this idea across in Canada without much success, but it seems to me we need to work on this strategy.
A number of years ago, there were some people who were inspired by the Zapatistas in Mexico and the effort to stop the WTO, including in Seattle. And they got together and produced this tremendous visual and print work called We Are Everywhere. Google it. You'll find both information about this incredible little booklet, very pictorial. It has a tremendous timeline. And what it describes is this worldwide movement that while the issues may be very different and on the surface seemingly not all that connected, the undergirding or overarching, depending on whatever metaphor you want to use, connection between them all is that people are resisting and people are creating around issues of self-rule, self-governance, the right to decide, that people feel that existing institutions across the board, whether it's this party, this hemisphere, that hemisphere, or whatever issue it is, that they are not in an authentic position to decide. And that needs to be what it's all about. That people have a right to make decisions that affect their lives, their communities, their natural world. And to me, monetary issues, the lack of having the fundamental right to decide how much money is going to be created, where it's going to go, for what purposes it's going to serve, is maybe the most intrinsic and the most core democratic or self-governance issue of all, and fits right into this worldwide movement for liberation, for democracy. So that's part of the colonization. We can't think of, we're more silo-ish. No. This is part of a global movement where people are both resisting being controlled by nation states, dictators, and transnational corporations, number one, and also a global movement. I mean, I was at the U.S. Social Forum just a couple of months ago in Detroit, and there were like 20,000 people, most of whom, or a majority of whom, were young people, and a better part of whom were focused on not so much resisting the negative, the evil, big, bad corporations and governments, but were focused on creating alternatives in everything. And that's, again, the flip side, the other side of the coin of lack of self-rule, of people wanting to create and have their own fingerprints on institutions, on groups, around food, on energy, on housing, on everything. So that's where we are. That's how we need to think of ourselves as part of this global movement for self-governance, for real, authentic self-rule.
My name is Ralph Atchison. I am also a Quaker and therefore a globalist in that sense. I have been writing against the Supreme Court decision which grants corporations the status of individuals. I view it as theft identity, or identity of the individual's identity by that particular action, and calling for a vigil against the Supreme Court. So I want to know, I just want a point of information from you, what is the address of the site in which you write about corporations? The website.
Well, there's a couple. You can check out movetoamend.org. One word, move to amend. And that's part, and they have both sort of intellectual resources as well as action steps. That, again, is what has sprung. It's the fruit of the planting of the seeds of what POCLAD did for, 12 to 15 years. And that contains both some, I think, rigorous research, but also the effort nationally and to a certain extent state by state of efforts to amend the Constitution through this campaign. MoveToAmend.org.
First of all, Greg, I want to thank you for a wonderful presentation. And it's very encouraging and thought-provoking and decolonizing mentally. I think a couple things are in our favor. I was reading an investment newsletter the other day, and they included a blog that said the definitions, the battles of liberal and conservative are passé. The real battle is the corporations versus the individual. This was in a conservative investment newsletter, which says to me that this idea of the corporate powers has come forward, and I think people are ready to be made aware, if they're not already aware. It's become so naked that I think we have an opportunity to call it, to name it, and organize people around it as you suggested. My question is, you mentioned strategy around the micro alternative or micro monetary alternative initiatives. Do you have some examples of any that we might?
Again, I think we're all trying to grapple with this stuff. Whenever the recession was in the 90s, we had a local currency. I know some people in this room don't necessarily believe in local currencies. We had a local currency to try to deal with this was in Akron, Ohio. Existed during sort of the valley, the worst part of the recession at that point. And we had people trading, exchanging goods and services with one another. As part of that process, we would gather people together once a month to meet, to trade and exchange, but also to discuss how the system was going. And we called it the People's Federal Reserve, the People's Reserve Board. And we tried to demystify these things. And we used those occasions not just to meet your needs, gee, I need a plumber, what can you do? I can bake a cake for you if, you provide me some plumbing services. But we use those occasions as arenas, as educational excuses to have a 15-minute description of what's going on in the macro world. So we use that as an entry point to make these issues together. And we had low-income people, poor people. We had survivalists, Mormons. We had the most eclectic. I've been doing community organizing for 25 years, and there is still to this day no project that has been more diverse politically, economically than that sort of local currency thing, because it brought all people together. But once we got them in that room, we locked that door and did a little bit of that education to make those kinds of connections. So that's an example of how, you got to bring people together. The populist movement in this country, in the United States, back in the 1870s to 1890s, was to this day considered to be the most successful social change movement, if you will, that brought together several million low-income, supposedly stupid, ignorant farmers who educated themselves on a lot of issues. And their approach to social change consisted of four segments, four elements: movement, recruitment, movement, education, movement, communication, and movement, politicalization. The movement, recruitment, how are we going to get people? How are we going to bring change? How are we going to oppose the bankers and the railroads, which were the most important, the banks and the railroads, most powerful corporate institutions of the day? How are we going to do that? Well, the movement recruitment element was, we're going to create cooperatives. And everybody, these farmers, they needed to pool their resources together. They were being killed individually, so they created these agricultural cooperatives, community or state by state. And that served as a vehicle to bring in thousands of people that once in, then they created their movement communication newspapers. The state of Texas alone had something like 2,000 lectures alone in one state that went around talking about this stuff. The movement politicalization, well, they formed the People's Party, which included the Omaha Platform of 1892 that contains some issues of banking and monetary reform and the like. So that is historically an example of, I think, this way to combine macro, micro, local, global.
Morning, Greg. Thank you for your talk. My question is, is there a particular resource where the Founding Fathers discussed their being against the corporate format, like the Federalist Papers? Did they discuss it in there? Those types of things. So I've always found that utilizing history from the beginning is effective in making an effective argument.
Wow, that's a good question. I don't know if there's one single resource. Jefferson, of course, came out in a number of his works against corporate power in general, banks in particular. I don't know if there is a single resource. If you come up to me afterwards, I'll sort of think through that more and maybe communicate with you. Okay.
Want to say
I think that's all. Thank you for your interest.